Mysterious school horror stories. The old Willow Ridge School stood just on the edge of town, its grand stone walls wrapped in ivy and silence. Generations of students had walked its halls. It was the pride of the town. Well, most of it was. There was one part of the campus everyone avoided, the North Wing, abandoned, sealed off for decades. It cast a shadow over the school that no one could ignore. Rumors swirled like whispers in the dark. They spoke of hauntings, tragic events, secrets buried deep. But the one story everyone knew? The story of Lucy. Lucy, the girl with the gift. She could play the piano like she was pulling the stars from the sky. In the 1940s, she spent every night in the North Wing's music room, her fingers dancing across the keys. But one stormy evening, Lucy vanished. Gone. No trace. Except for the piano. Students swore they still heard it. Lonely notes drifting through the air when the wind howled just right. Harley? She'd heard it all before, and every time she rolled her eyes. Ghost stories, she'd scoff. Seriously? It's just an old building. Her friends weren't convinced. They dared her one night, sliding a set of old rusty keys into her hand. One night, Madison teased, a sly grin on her face. Record it. If you're so brave, prove it. The keys were cold, heavy in Harley's palm. For the first time, doubt crept in. But she wasn't about to let them see it. Fine, Harley said, her voice steady. Too steady. You'll see. It's nothing. That night, Harley stood before the North Wing's doors. Her friends lingered at a distance, their figures small under the pale glow of a street lamp. See you in the morning, Madison called, her voice more nervous than teasing this time. The doors creaked open. The air inside was wrong, thick, heavy, a chill that pressed against Harley's skin, making her shiver. Her flashlight beam swept over broken desks, shattered glass, and peeling walls. Each step stirred up dust that clung to the stale air. Just an old building, she muttered under her breath, trying to calm her pounding heart. Nothing to it. And then, she heard it. A piano. The sound was faint, distant, like it was floating through the walls. Harley froze. Her breath caught in her throat, her grip tightening on the flashlight. The beam wavered, casting wild, jagged shadows. It's just the wind, she whispered. But the words felt hollow. The melody grew louder. It wasn't random. It wasn't chaos. It was a song, delicate, mournful, haunting. Drawn by the sound, Harley followed it down the crumbling hallways, her steps hesitant, her heart hammering. Finally, she reached the music room. The door creaked open, the sound grating in the silence. The piano stood in the center, untouched by time, its polished surface gleaming in the faint light. Harley stepped closer, each movement feeling heavier than the last. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The music stopped. She turned and saw her. A girl sat on the piano bench, her white dress glowing faintly in the dim room. Her head tilted slightly, her face just out of the shadows. "Do you play?" the girl asked, her voice soft. Too soft. Harley's chest tightened. Her throat felt dry. Who are you?" The girl's lips curved into a faint, sad smile. "My name is Lucy. Do you play the piano?" "No," Harley stammered. This can't be real. You're not real." Lucy's smile didn't waver. "Stories come from somewhere, don't they?" She gestured to the bench beside her. "Sit with me." Harley wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to turn, to bolt, to never look back. But she couldn't move. She sat beside Lucy. The air around her was freezing, each breath visible in the dim light. "Will you play with me?" Lucy asked, placing her hands lightly on the keys. Harley shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know how." Lucy began to play. The melody was gentle at first, haunting. It filled the room, the sound wrapping around Harley like a heavy fog. Images flooded Harley's mind. She saw Lucy, younger, alive, Pouring her soul into the piano, her fingers moving with desperate precision. She saw the storm outside that fateful night, the frustration in Lucy's eyes, the tears, the silence that followed. "You're trapped here," Harley murmured, her voice shaking. Lucy's hands paused, hovering over the keys. "They locked me away," she said quietly. "They forgot me, but my music, it keeps me here." "What can I do?" Harley asked, her voice breaking. Lucy turned to her eyes shimmering with a sadness that felt endless. "Play my song. Let them hear it again. Let them remember." Harley's hands moved to the keys, trembling. She had never touched a piano before, but as her fingers pressed down, the notes came instinctively. Lucy's melody poured out, software grieving. Beautiful. As the final note lingered, the room shifted. The air felt lighter, warmer. The shadows pulled back and Lucy began to fade. Her smile was gentle now, grateful. "Thank you," she whispered. "Now, they'll remember." And then, she was gone. Harley stumbled out of the north wing as the first light of dawn broke. Her friends rushed to meet her, their faces pale with worry. "You're okay," Madison exclaimed, pulling Harley into a hug. Harley's voice was steady, though her hands still shook. "I'm fine, but we need to talk." Over the next few days, Harley shared Lucy's story. She played the melody for anyone who would listen. The school responded. The north wing was restored, its walls echoing with life and remembrance. But on stormy nights when the wind howled through the halls, Harley swore she could still hear it. Faint, software A piano's melody drifting through the air. Lucy's song, a reminder of the girl who refused to be forgotten. This is The Mysterious School, horror story number 2. Cedar Brook High School had always felt heavy. Its tall brick walls, thick with ivy, loomed over the quiet streets, casting long, dark shadows across the neighborhood. To anyone who passed by, it looked like a school trapped in time. But those who had spent any real time there knew better. There was something about Cedar Brook, a presence, a weight to it, that felt off. It had stood for over a century, and with each passing year, the building seemed to absorb more of the stories, the whispers, the secrets. The air was thick with history, and recently students had begun to notice strange things, a flickering light here, a sudden chill there, and sometimes the feeling of being watched. But everyone shrugged it off. It was just an old school, right? Then came Elise Hartman. Elise was new, just transferred to Cedar Brook for her senior year, and from the moment she stepped inside the school, she felt it. That feeling, like the walls were alive, like they were waiting for her. Her friend Lauren had been at Cedar Brook for a while, and from the moment Elise met her, she could tell Lauren was different, quiet, a little jumpy, always looking over her shoulder, like she was hiding something. Every time Elise asked her what was wrong, Lauren would brush it off. "It's just school gossip," she'd say. "Nothing to worry about." But Elise didn't buy it. Something was off. Something Lauren wasn't saying. One crisp autumn afternoon, the kind of day that feels thick with tension, Elise stayed late after class to prepare for an exam. The school was quiet, just her and the janitor who was busy mopping the floors in the far hallway. Elise gathered her books and started down the long, dim corridor. It was then that she heard it. Footsteps. At first they were faint, soft, almost too soft to notice. Elise paused, glancing over her shoulder. But no one was there. The hallway stretched out behind her, empty. She shrugged it off, thinking it was just the janitor, his mop dragging across the floor. She took another step, and the footsteps came again. Louder this time, closer, almost too close. Her heartbeat quickened. She turned sharply, but again, there was nothing. The hall was still empty. She shook her head. "It's just your mind," she told herself. "Nothing to be afraid of." But then it happened again. The footsteps, louder, growing nearer. Her pulse raced. She could feel the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "Number, this isn't right." With quickened steps, she rushed toward the exit, but the sound of footsteps kept pace with her. Step, step, step. Her breathing grew shallow. She could hear her own heart pounding in her ears. And then suddenly the footsteps stopped. Dead silence. She froze, standing in the middle of the hallway, every muscle tense. She turned slowly. Nothing. She exhaled shakily. Maybe she was just imagining it. But then a door at the end of the hallway slammed shut. Bang! Elise jumped. Her breath caught in her throat and her heart raced. She whipped around to see what caused the noise. Nothing. A cold shiver ran down her spine. And then she saw it. At the far end of the hallway, in the dim light, stood a figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall. Its limbs stretched far beyond what was humanly possible. Its head tilted to a grotesque angle. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed faintly in the dark like hollow black orbs. Elise's heart stopped. This wasn't real. But there it was, standing there, unmoving, its eyes locked onto her. The air around her felt thick, heavy. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She could only stare at the figure. Seconds stretched into eternity. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body was paralyzed. Every instinct told her to flee, to get away from this thing. But her legs wouldn't obey. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring. And Elise could do nothing but stare back, frozen in fear. Just as she thought she might collapse from sheer terror, the figure vanished. 1 second it was there, and the next, it was gone, like it had never existed. Was it a trick of the light? Was she just tired? But she didn't care. She turned on her heel and ran, not stopping until she was halfway home, gasping for breath, her legs burning. Every part of her screamed to go back, to figure out what had happened, but she couldn't. She couldn't go back to that place, not after what she had seen. The next day, Elise met up with Lauren. Her hands were shaking as she recounted what had happened, her voice trembling. Lauren wasn't surprised. "You've heard of Mr. Hawthorne, right?" she asked softly, glancing around as if someone might be listening. Elise nodded. Mr. Hawthorne, the former principal, a legend. Everyone knew his name, but nobody spoke about him. Lauren's voice dropped to a whisper. "They say he never really left." Elise frowned. "What do you mean? He disappeared, right?" Lauren nodded, her eyes darkening. "That's what they tell you. But some people think he still haunts the school. They say he watches, and sometimes he shows up in the East Wing." Elise's blood went cold. "The East Wing?" Lauren nodded again. "That's where he disappeared. No one ever talks about it, but if you spend too much time there, things start to happen. People say they feel him or they see him." Elise shivered, feeling a chill crawl up her spine. The thought of Mr. Hawthorne, his cold eyes, his eerie presence, haunted her now, and she couldn't get rid of it. Determined to understand, Elise and Lauren ventured into the East Wing after school. The building felt colder here, the air heavier. It was an old section of the school, forgotten by most, filled with abandoned classrooms and offices. As they walked deeper into the East Wing, Elise felt something tighten in her chest. Something was wrong. She could feel it. The air was thick with dread. When they reached the old principal's office, Elise stopped in her tracks. The door stood ajar, the room bathed in an unsettling dim light. Dust floated in the air. But it wasn't the room that made her stomach churn. It was the photograph on the far wall. It was an old picture of Mr. Hawthorne, tall, stiff, his arms folded in front of him, a perfect school principal. But it was his eyes. His eyes. They weren't normal. They were too wide, too knowing, and they stared straight at Elise. Her heart began to pound. This can't be real, but then the door slammed shut. Bang! The sound rattled through her bones. She spun around, but no one was there. She tried to pull at the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if it was locked from the other side. The room grew cold. The shadows stretched unnaturally long. The presence, the weight in the room grew thicker, until Elise felt like she couldn't breathe. "Leave, before it's too late." The voice was a whisper, a voice that wasn't hers. Elise's blood ran cold, her body frozen with terror. She looked around, but the room was empty. No one was there. The door opened. Without thinking, Elise bolted out of the room, not stopping until she was outside, gulping down fresh air, her chest heaving. That was the last time she ever stepped foot in Cedar Brook High. The school, with its dark corners, its history, and the shadows of Mr. Hawthorne would stay with her forever. It wasn't just a building, it was a presence. And as Elise walked away, she knew one thing for certain. Cedar Brook had never let go of its past, and it never would. This is The Mysterious School, horror story number 3, Rosewood Academy School. It was beautiful. That was the first thing Brooke noticed when she arrived. The campus was perfect, with tall oak trees lining the walkways and ivy draping over the old stone buildings. It was like something out of a movie, the kind of place where you expect to find success, opportunity, and tradition. It seemed like a dream, or maybe even a fairy tale. But for Brooke, something felt wrong. She tried to brush it off. Maybe it was the typical nerves of being the new kid. She tried to focus on her studies to keep her head down, but the feeling lingered, gnawing at her every day. There was something about Rosewood that felt off, and she couldn't shake it. The halls were too quiet, the students, always so serious. But the silence. It wasn't peaceful. It was unsettling. It was as though everyone was walking around holding their breath, watching, waiting. One afternoon when she was leaving the library, something strange happened. She found herself walking down a long hallway she hadn't noticed before. The hall was empty. Not a single soul, just rows of closed doors. The air was colder than usual too, unnaturally cold. The kind of chill that gets deep into your bones and refuses to leave. As she walked, Brooke noticed something that caught her attention. A door, slightly ajar at the end of the hall. Just a crack. She stood there, hesitating. Why did she feel so drawn to it? She wasn't one to go exploring, not really. But this door, it called to her. Without thinking, she pushed it open. The room inside was dark. Dust coated the floor and the desks, and old portraits lined the walls. It was like stepping into another time, a forgotten corner of the school. But there was one thing that made her stop dead in her tracks. A mirror. It stood tall and framed in dark wood, its surface faintly gleaming. As Brooke's eyes locked onto it, she felt something strange, something she couldn't explain. She walked closer, her feet slow and deliberate, each step louder in the eerie silence. She could feel her heart beating faster, a tightness in her chest. And then she saw it. It wasn't her reflection. It was a girl who looked just like her. Same uniform, same long hair. But there was something about the girl that was wrong. Her eyes were empty, hollow. The lifelessness in them sent a shiver straight down Brooke's spine. It felt as though the girl wasn't even looking at her. She was staring right through her. Brooke's breath hitched and her heart thudded in her chest. She stepped forward, instinctively drawn to the mirror. But as her fingers brushed the cold glass, something shifted. The girl's expression, it changed. Her face contorted, the sadness in her eyes turning into something darker. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Brooke's skin crawled. She jerked back, a cold sweat breaking out on her forehead. What was that? The air around her grew even colder, like a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on her. She couldn't look away from the mirror, and then just as she was about to turn and run, she heard it. A voice. "Don't." It was low, barely a whisper. Brooke spun around, but the room was empty. No one was there. No one. Her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. She backed away from the mirror, every instinct telling her to leave, but she couldn't tear herself away. She was frozen. With shaking hands, she closed the door behind her. Her head was spinning, the strange, haunting image of the girl still fresh in her mind. That night, Brooke couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those empty eyes, that girl. Who was she? What was she trying to tell her? The next morning, she went back to the library. She had to know more. She had to understand what had happened. Maybe there was something, some clue hidden in the school's history that could explain it. After searching for hours, Brooke found what she was looking for. A journal. It was tucked between two old volumes, forgotten and dusty. She pulled it out, trembling slightly as she opened it to the first page. The entries were written in a hurried, frantic hand, like the writer had been desperately trying to get their thoughts down before they were lost. "The mirrors," the first entry read. "They're not just reflections. They're windows. Windows into something else. If you look too long, it's not you who'll see. It's something else. Something that waits." Brooke's pulse quickened. She flipped through the pages, each more disturbing than the last. The writer's tone grew more desperate, and then one final entry. The last words were barely legible, smudged with ink and desperation. "I saw her again. She's not alone. There are others. And now they're waiting for me. Waiting for all of us. Don't look into the mirrors. If you do, they'll come for you." Brooke's hands were shaking as she closed the journal. Don't look into the mirrors. She didn't understand. But that feeling, the weight, the fear, pressed into her chest, suffocating her. The girl, the mirror, the East Wing. There was something more going on here. Something she hadn't fully grasped yet. That night, the pull was stronger than ever. She had to go back. She had to know. Something, someone, was calling her to the East Wing. Brooke stood in front of the same mirror again, the room eerily silent just like before. The air was freezing, her breath clouding in front of her. She reached for the mirror, her fingers trembling. But as her hand touched the glass, something shifted. A shadow, a whisper, a cold, malevolent presence filled the room. "You shouldn't have come back." Brooke froze. The mirror seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't describe. She turned, her eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing there. Nothing except a flicker in the corner of her vision. For a split second, she thought she saw the girl again, standing just beyond the mirror, her eyes wide with terror, begging her to leave. But before she could react, everything went dark. The door slammed shut behind her. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her breath ragged as the room seemed to close in on her. Shadows twisted around her, pulling her deeper into the darkness. The whispers grew louder, the cold grew unbearable, and then, in the silence, Brooke heard it again. "You shouldn't have come back." The next morning, the East Wing was empty, as it always was. The mirror was gone, vanished. And Brooke? Brooke was gone too. Some say the mirrors in Rosewood Academy still hold the echoes of those who disappeared. They say if you stand in front of one long enough, you'll see the reflection of someone else. Someone who isn't supposed to be there, someone who never left. And if you're not careful, they might just reach through. But no one knows for sure. Some things, it seems, are meant to remain hidden. Some things are better left forgotten.